Hello. Now we're going to go on to section 2 of chapter 23 about Africa and some of the programs for development there and what we can or can't do to try to help Africa with many of the problems still facing Africa today and what our role as Christians is in that process. So we know there are many barriers to stability in Africa, as we talked last time about the ethnic and the religious fighting and the disease, drought. All these things are keeping Africa becoming a successful and stable continent. And so, what are some of the choices we can make, and how has it changed the life of Africans? Mentioned earlier is after the freedoms were won, the loyalty oftentimes is to their ethnic group, whether it's the Hassan, the Hutus, all these different types of tribes, but not to their necessarily the national government. So civil wars oftentimes cropped up, and to keep everything together, you would often see a one-party system, and usually a bad government where the military yielded all the power over the people. In the Sudan, the Muslim majority in the north has been for many years now persecuting the Christians in the south. Recently, the country of South Sudan was created, where that has alleviated some of the problems due to pressure from other countries. Much, some of that has subsided, but not to the point where it's been solved completely. Also, we see evidences of blatant persecution of the Church of Christ, which has been prophesied in these last days, and we can then um, be aware that even though in North America we live in relative comfort, many of God's people are being persecuted by uh, unbelievers and in some cases also people of other faith like Muslims. Because of the brutal dictatorships of people like Idi Amin in Uganda, who was infamous in the 1970s for killing tens of thousands of his own people and causing, even by his own hand sometimes. But that's just one example of many of the African countries that have now since become uh, more reformed and more democratic once they've thrown off people like Idi Amin in Uganda. For the newly independent countries of Africa in the 1950s and 60s, they had choices, of course, politically, but also what type of economy, what to base their economy on. Many looked to more of a socialist uh, system, others to more capitalist, or many also tried to have a mixed economy where the government took charge of some things, but private enterprise was also allowed. Another big factor after independence was the urbanization of Africa. Many of the rural people began swarming to the cities, even though they weren't set up for that, in order to find a job, maybe, or health care or education. So, depending on cash crops, just one for export is very risky to be only dependent on one economic indicator for trade. Also, the debt. Many countries have forgiven their debts to Africa. The loans to try to build up Africa that were wasted are not effective. So some of these have been now forgiven. Many, many critical issues. This is just a few of them. The population in Africa continues to go exponentially up. The effects of deforestation, drought, famine, and then the AIDS and now the Ebola outbreaks. There's many different disease outbreaks that today in America are held in check by modern medicine, but not so in Africa. Also, pure water. These are just a few of the critical issues you'll be tackling and discussing, and what our role in that God has given us so much in our country. What can we do that might benefit these problems? So you see in some of the countries here the rise of the population, and life expectancy. The desertification of Africa has been another issue. As the desert continues to expand, it takes away other economic opportunities as they turn into desertous countries, and as topsoil continues to drift off and continues to be more and more desertous. So again, urbanization, the Islamic versus Christian violence, and the effects of persecution on Christianity, even though Christianity has grown in Africa significantly because of a lot of dedicated efforts by missionaries and church groups. There are many, many Christians in Africa today. God has many of his people there. It's important that we understand that too when we consider how best to help Africa, that it's important to reach out to all of God's people wherever they might be.